Okay, so let's take a look at system view controllers. System view controllers are something all of us who use iOS apps are actually quite familiar with. You know, when you tap share and you want to share something and you're presented with a list of apps that you can share it with, or you can even go about doing AirDrop. These are part of the system view controllers. So when we're using system view controllers, things like alerts, we're able to display alerts to the user. It allows us to share content from our apps with other apps and with people. We can send messages, and it also gives us access to the photo library and to the camera. So system view controllers are something that we use all the time within iOS apps. And there'll be something as an iOS user, as an iPhone or iPad user, that you've probably used on a regular basis. So we're going to take a look at 5 different controllers in the next few minutes. We have the UI activity controller. And the UI activity controller is something that allows us to share with other apps. We've got the SF Safari view controller. And the SF Safari view controller is one of the view controllers that lets us open up a web page, a Safari web page within our app, so we don't have to leave it. We have the UI alert controller, and this is a controller that allows us to present new information and options to the user, often in the form of an alert. Be careful, what are you doing? Again, alerts are things that we're fairly familiar with. There's the UI image picker, the UI image picker view controller. Again, you've used it, you just didn't realize you were using it. You've used an app and it said, let's make a profile picture. Would you like to use one from your photo library or take a new picture from the camera? That was the UI image picker view controller. Yes, it's a bit of a mouthful. And there's also the MF Mail Compose View controller, which allows us to send email from within our apps. So these are all view controllers that you're probably familiar with and have used when using apps. But now we're going to take a look at how we can build those into our apps and have our apps use them. So let's take a look at the UI activity view controller. So if we have a look at the slide here, you can see on the left-hand side 2 screen captures. When we tap the share button in the first image on that left-hand side, we're presented with our sharing options. And those sharing options we can see in that second image. What happens? An instance of UI activity view controller is created. And we need to grab the image from the UI image view. The UI activity view controller's initializer method is launched, and this takes a parameter called activity items. Now, activity items is actually in an array, and this array is of type any. So anything can go into it. And in this situation, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting the image into the array. And then we present this view controller to the user. So let's take a look at the code that does this for us. So here we see the code. The image is taken from our UI image view instance. In this case, we've called it image view. Very creative in our names, as you can see. We create an instance of UI activity controller, and to its initializing parameters, we pass activity items. And we add the image to the array. The application activities parameter is used for custom services, but we're not going to be using that one, so we'll leave it as is. The popover presentation controller, now this is about where the controller will actually be presented to the user on the screen. Now, on small iOS devices, such as iPhones, it really has no impact as it's presented from the bottom. But when we are on an iPad, for instance, we can choose how and where that will be presented to the user. And in the screencast, we'll be creating this app that you see there from scratch, and we'll work through it, modifying the code as we go to be covering all of the different buttons there.
We're now going to look at the SF Safari View Controller. So what is an SF Safari View Controller, you may ask? Well, from the name, you've probably guessed it's something to do with the Safari web browser. The SF Safari View Controller allows us to open a web browser right inside our app. We can actually insert a web view into any of our own views to be put inside our app, and we can present that however we'd like. So how do we actually do this? Well, until this point, generally what we've imported is the UI kit and the foundation frameworks. We have to add another framework to our app to be able to import the SF Safari View Controller. So that's the Safari Services framework that we'll be importing, and we just need to put that reference at the top of our viewcontroller.swift file. So to actually use that SF Safari View Controller, we do need to know three things. We need to create a web address, so we create a URL, much like we would when we're typing it into Safari ourselves in the Safari app or in another web browser. So we need to create that URL from a string, so Apple does have a specific way we represent that URL. We then need to create our SF Safari View Controller and then tell it that, well, this is the URL we want to go to. And then we need to say, okay, show that to the user. And once you've done all those steps, you'll end up with something like you see in the slides here. And it's got a nice screenshot there of the Curtin University webpage. Let's have a look at some code now that does this. So we can see here on this slide the code that we have to actually bring up our SF Safari View Controller. And as per usual, Apple takes care of a lot of the nuts and bolts for us, which means we don't need to write too much code to get this all to work. So we start off here with an IB action function, which is connected to a UI button that we would have pressed, much like any other UI button we've dealt with before. But what will happen is when we tap that UI button, it will pop up a Safari View Controller, probably with a modal animation that displays the Curtin web page. So if we think back to the elements that we need to create the URL. So we have that line there, if let URL, and we create a URL from the string just being the address to the Curtin website. We then create an instance of our SF Safari View Controller and pass it as an input parameter, that URL. And we're going to store that in, we're using let, we're going to store that in Safari View Controller. And then it's a matter of just calling the present function. We're saying we're going to present that Safari View Controller to the user, which will have that web page in it. We will have an animation to complete it. And after completion, we don't want to run any more code. And it's as simple as that. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines effectively. Another thing we might be interested in is the UI alert controller. So the UI alert controller is a way to get the user's attention. It allows them to interact with our app. We can present them with options and get a choice from them in a different way to some of the other ways we've done previously. And to be able to present a UI alert controller, and when you see the example on the next slide, you'll probably recognize it instantly. It's a very common controller that is used. We need to specify the alert title, the message, and how we're going to present it to them. Is it going to be an alert at the center of the screen or an action sheet at the bottom of the screen? So let's go and take a look at the code to get this done. And you might find it hard to believe, but it's actually a little bit more difficult than presenting an entire web page. So we can see here with this nice picture of David on the right that a UI alert is just when we have one of those little windows that pops up on top of our app, and it might just have one option to tell us to dismiss it, or it might have a couple of options to choose from. So in this case, our code again, we're connecting it to an IB action function that will be connected to a button press. So when we tap a button, the alert will come up. We then have to, inside our function, create our alert, an instance of our UI alert controller. We need to tell it what the title is, and in this case, in the picture we can see there that we've set the title to choose image source. We've set the message to nothing, so we don't have to supply a message, but the message is that text that goes below the title in that same area, but in a smaller font. We then also say what type we want. Do we want the action sheet or do we want the alert? And in this case, we've said the alert, the traditional alert. We then need to create what's called a UI alert action, and that allows us to respond to what the user chooses. So in this case, we want a cancel action. So we go and say that the title of that is cancel. We make it of style cancel, and we don't actually add a handler to it. But what we do need to do is say for the alert controller we've created, we need to set its action, well, we need to add an action because we could have multiple. Think about those alerts you get that says, one of them might be okay and one of them might be cancel. So we just add this cancel in, and because we've set it of the style cancel, when we tap that, it will remove the alert. After that, we then need to go and say that the source view will be the sender. So of course, effectively we're binding this alert to the main view that we're dealing with. And then of course, our last but not least line of code is our present again. So much like we had for our SF Safari view controller, to actually go and do it, to bring it up to the user, we have to call present and pass the alert controller to it. So I think that's pretty much it for our UI alert controller. It's a pretty simple example, but as we can see, there's a lot of power we can actually do with alerts. And while they might not fit directly into the same way that your app has sort of been working, it might be a bit different and jump out and look different to the user. That's generally why we like to do it. We have that style a bit differently to gain the user's attention.
So let's now take a look at UI image picker controller. So in using this controller, it becomes possible to access from within our apps the camera as well as the photo library on device. Now, one of the things you need to be careful of when you're building using this is what's available in the simulator. If you've got a device, now's the time to be building to your device. Otherwise, you may find when you go to access the camera, your app will crash within the simulator. Just a side note there. So, to be able to access the camera or the library device, we're going to need to adopt the UI image picker controller delegate and the UI navigation controller delegate protocols. So if you recall from our first course, we did protocols and we implemented protocols. So we'll need to go back and implement those protocols. And once this is done, we can go about creating an instance of UI image picker controller. And then the delegate method needs to be set to the view controller we created. So once we've done this and we start to use it, you will know from using iOS devices, options are going to be presented to the user. Okay, so we must deal with this. Now, hopefully you recall from just a few minutes ago, we used the UI alert controller to be dealing with user input and presenting options and their responses. So we will need to create a UI alert controller for the response of the user. Now, it's important that the user is only given access to the camera or to the photo library if they exist. So we'll need to write some code to protect crashes. Now, we do this using the UI image picker controller is source type available method. And the is source type available method checks if our source type is available. Now it will return a true or a false. And depending on what it returns, we can then deal with that and continue on or say bye-bye. So here's the code that we need to do this. We create a UI image picker controller and we set the delegate to this one that we've just created. And you can see that there in the code. And now we set up our UI alert controllers just as we did a short time ago, and we're able to deal with the user's input as we've learnt. Now, we test as to whether or not the camera exists. We also check to see if the photo library actually exists. And now we can present the alert controller to the user. So the final thing we need to do is actually take the image either from the photo library or the camera, depending on the user's selection. Now, this method is the one that informs the delegate that the user has indeed selected a new image to use. Okay, the media we need is the info dictionary, and you can see that there in the code, the info dictionary there. Now, the dictionary keys, so remembering back to our first course where we were looking at arrays and dictionaries. So the key for this dictionary is of type UI image picker controller.info key. Now we start with the original image, and then we want to change it to the selected image. And you think now we're done. Not quite. Almost. One more thing. If you were to run this without taking this next step, the app won't behave how you think it will. So we need to go all the way into our info P list and make a couple of changes. So we need to change in the info P list and add access to the camera as well as access to the photo library. And in the screencast, we're going to be doing that. So you'll see exactly how to do that when we move into the screencast.
So now let's look at the MF Mail Compose View Controller, and that's quite a mouthful. But much like how we looked at our SF Safari View Controller, you can probably guess that this one allows us to send email messages. So that's why we'd go and put an MF Mail Compose View Controller into our app. It allows us to send emails from within our app. Now, why would we want to do that? Perhaps we want to have the ability to generate something out of our app and send it off as an email. Maybe it's even just to send an error report to us, the developers, to say we didn't do something quite right. But before we can do that, there are a few things we need to do first. Much like we imported that extra framework to allow us to do all the Safari magic, we need to import the Message UI framework to allow us to create an MF Mail Compose View controller. So once we've done that, we then need to adopt the MF Mail Compose Controller Delegate protocol to allow us to use the Mail Compose delegate within our view controllers. So that's where we'll start when we go and start to define our class. After that, there's a few things we need to check before we can actually go and send a message. And the first is whether mail services are available. And to do that, we call the canSendMail function or method. One thing that should be noted is if users use third-party mail applications on their device, they might not actually have an email account set up in iOS or as a whole. So it's possible that you could be checking your email on a device but not actually have the ability to send mail unless you do have your email account set up so you're able to use it in the built-in mail app. Once we've done that, we then go and create our MF Mail Compose View controller. Well, we create an instance of it. We then go and set the delegate to self to connect it all up. We then actually go and say, well, what's in the message? We configure all the different aspects of the mail message. And then, of course, as we always do with these things, we present it, and then once we're done, we dismiss it. So let's go and take a look at the code to do that. From what I've just said, it probably sounds like a fair bit of code, and you'd be right. So again, we've connected it to a UI button, and we've got our IB action function here. Now, first thing is we have to test the availability of mail services, and if there aren't any, we don't continue. And that's why we have our guard here at the top. So you have our guard, not MF Mail Compose View Controller.canSendMail else. So if we're unable to send mail, what will happen is the guard will print to the console, not that the user will see it. Cannot send mail. It's good for us when we're developing to know that. And it will return, which means it won't continue with the rest of that function. However, if it can send mail, so all's good, we continue on with the rest of the lines in our function. So once we've checked whether mail can be sent, and we go, yeah, we can, we then need to create our MF Mail Compose View controller, and our instance will be assigned to the variable Mail Composer. We then go and set a few different things. We have to go and set the mail composed delegate to self to connect it all together first. We then need to go and put in our recipients. Apparently we're sending an email to taylor@swift.com today. Very funny, being the Swift programming language. We're then going to put in the subject, testing for you, Taylor Swift, and it's just calling these set to recipients and set subject methods. And we can see in set to recipients, we actually have an array there. So we could put multiple recipients in if we wanted to. But the subject is just a string. And then we have set message body, and set message body accepts a string there, but we also have a second parameter, is HTML. So we can actually use HTML tags to make our message appear a bit more exciting if we want to, but we're not going to today. It's going to be a plain old text message just saying, hello Taylor, hello world. And after that, it's just a matter of calling our present function. And because we've set the delegate, that'll take care of what happens when we dismiss it. But up comes the mail composer, and there we go. So we're going to take a look at what we do to dismiss the view on the next slide. So because this is the bit of the code that shows the view controller, we then need to have a different bit of code to get rid of it. So because we had connected that delegate together, we do need to create the delegate function, which in case we wanted to do anything else, we could add some extra code in there. But all we're going to do is create our delegate method mail compose controller, and that will have those input parameters there. And then we just call dismiss, which is the opposite of our present. And that's it. We are done. So there was quite a bit to go through here, both not just in the MF mail compose view controller, but all those other view controllers, system view controllers we've gone over. So now let's take a look at the screencast and take an in-depth look at how we can use these when we build an app.